Hey everybody, it's David Condry. I'm here to talk to you today about data access governance. My team is responsible for the engineering effort and the product development effort around data access governance for Micro Focus. Specifically, we're going to be talking today about what data access governance is, how it relates to overall data governance, and how it relates to identity and access management and identity governance and administration. More specifically, the agenda is as follows. We'll be talking about really what's our ambition with data access governance. What is it we're trying to do? What benefit are we trying to provide? We're going to spend a little bit of time on a primer around unstructured data itself. What is it and how do we classify that? Then we're going to talk about the role of identity in data security. Maybe very apparent, maybe it's not. Many organizations would say that effective access control for unstructured data is a very complex undertaking. And we're going to talk about how to overcome that complexity using just a very prescriptive phased approach. Then lastly, we're going to talk a little bit about the solution position in the market and how the market's evolving with identity and really specific use cases. In follow-on videos, we'll do a deep dive into some of the latter topics, get into the technology itself and specific deployment solutions that you might be wanting to undertake. What if we could help you overcome your greatest challenges around securing your most important unstructured data? That would probably be pretty valuable to many organizations today. Maybe even more valuable is being able to do it in a way that improves your security posture easily and in a way that allows us to show value in your organization and for you very quickly. In polling a number of organizations, many have said that improving their security posture or improving security in the organization in general is their number one priority. It makes complete sense today. In terms of what does it mean to improve your security posture, security is always done on a scale where perfect security is not attainable, and if it were, the usability of the system would probably be diminished. But we're always striving to improve from a security perspective. And so that's what we mean by improving or moving to a better security posture. Now, the way that we would contribute to that has to do with what many would say, or protecting what many would say is the lifeblood of an organization. It's data. There's many drivers around this. It could be privacy regulations that are creating a need there, or governance or compliance mandates or requirements that are at the forefront, or maybe even more tactically improving your position to battle real day-to-day threats like ransomware. How do we improve the security posture? Well, we improve it by uniting identity and data in the solution and in your organization. We also overcome complexity in the face of what for many organizations is overwhelming amounts of data. We also can bridge gaps that, if unchecked, create a false sense of security. And then lastly, engaging and empowering data owners in the line of business. And we'll spend some time talking about each of these as we move forward. To get a bit of a toehold based on your background, let's talk a little bit about the solution landscape and in relation to solutions or markets that you may be more familiar with, such as if you're an identity person, you're familiar with identity governance and administration, you're familiar with identity management and the relationship to identity governance. If you're more on the data side of things, you're probably more familiar with just the trials and tribulations of effective data management, things like data discovery, those kinds of things. But data access governance is kind of sitting at the intersection of those things. And then maybe more importantly, or most importantly, is how does the concept of data privacy come to play in today's world? So let's talk a little bit about unstructured data. What is it? And then how do we go about securing it? So unstructured data is pretty simple. It's the files and folders or files that you and I create each and every day. This very presentation is a piece of unstructured data. It's a PowerPoint presentation. But whether it's office documents, media files, CAD drawings, any of those kinds of things, the proposals that you're making out there, or the perspectives that you're bringing to others in your organization, you're probably doing it through unstructured data. A particular piece of unstructured data is just a file, such as this spreadsheet called forecast here. This has some metadata around it within the file system or within the repository. It has things like who owns it, when was it created, when was last modified or accessed, how big is it, are there specific attributes around it like read-only or delete-inhibit, those kinds of things. So the organization of the file system itself has metadata around the files in addition to what's living in the file itself. And this can be really useful in terms of management. Now, we'd be a little remiss if we didn't really talk about the difference between structured and unstructured data. So if unstructured data are these files that are living, out here in many repositories that we deal with every day, the structured data is really data that would be represented in databases, for example. So a particular application database like SAP or Salesforce or something like that, you're going to have rows and columns in the database that represent the data that's there. So that's the structure of it is what makes it structured. What's really amazing is the amount of unstructured data that we create in an organization. It's estimated that 80% of the data footprint of an organization is unstructured data. For many organizations, this sea of data that we have been creating, that we create each and every day, is very daunting. It can be potentially very large. For many organizations that we deal with, it's in the petabytes, and it's not in the hundreds or thousands or even hundreds of thousands of files. It's maybe billions of files. One of the things that it's easy to get lost in is that in terms of this is where the overwhelming aspect can come in for many organizations. But it's really important to think about the way that data is inherently organized and using that inherent organization to help you move quickly and easily to a better security posture. So the way that we want to do that is leveraging how people organize and work together inherently. So people have been organizing and sharing information for millennia, whether it was around a fire in a cave or moving forward, whether we're dealing with a conference table and we're gathering around a piece of data or information to share and build upon, or it's more structured or more futuristic in terms of things like Microsoft Teams. We're gathering around data. We've been organizing data together for specific purposes for much longer than IT has been around. For 100 years or more, There have been file folders but they were stored in filing cabinets where people put data or information together and stored them in these things called folders. And so when we move to a more modern information technology paradigm, that paradigm followed suit. So as we think about how data is organized, people inherently put stuff together. They organize things in folders. For example, you may have the finance data all together, which we see up here, or the merger and acquisition data down here, or the research data is in a place together. Now, I'm not suggesting that things are always where they should be, because that's not the case. But just inherently, we all organize, whether it's on our local machines or in repositories, we gather around and organize things together that are supposed to be together. So let's leverage that is the premise. So we want to talk about, we talked about the finance data. Now, in many organizations or many structures, repositories, there's not only one folder, there's multiple folders that are where there's subfolders and data is organized within there. Let's just talk about finance for a minute. Now, how do people access this data? Well, typically, and this would be in a network storage infrastructure, you're going to have groups which have members that occupy and those groups are given rights to the folder, and and this is really how we go about securing files. Direct security on a specific file is very, very difficult, not only to manage in a large organization with billions of files, but it's also, in many cases, impractical based on how files are dealt with by the applications themselves. So what we really are talking about is securing files in a place by securing the place itself, securing the location. So this is where our first taste of identity and role tied to a resource for an entitlement come to bear. So let's dig into identity a little bit. How does identity come to play? Micro Focus, there's a moniker that identity powers security. Well, that's true for data as well as applications, as well as access to infrastructures. So what's the role of identity specifically as it relates to data security? In many organizations, we kind of have things segregated a little bit, where if you're an identity person, you may be thinking, well, I'm not really sure that we have a lot to do with data security. We have data people for that. Well, let me tell you that I'll give you a heads up of what's coming in a minute. The data people count on identity, and they count on identity being correct, even if many of them identity is not at the forefront of what they worry about on a day-to-day basis. So let's talk about security. What is security? Well, security is very simple. It's controlling access to something. It's whether it's a key to a building, to your home, to a premise, or to some application or a piece of data. It's really simple. It's about making sure the people who have that need access have it, and the rest don't. It's really that simple. So access security is at its purest form is about the right people having the right access to the right stuff in the right place at the right time. And so people and access inherently go together. So that's why identity and role, we've been using it for entitlement management to applications for some time. And now we're making data a first-class citizen in that identity infrastructure. And so then we're actually applying industry standard paradigms like zero trust, and then within zero trust, the application of least privilege, and then from a privacy standpoint, separation of duties, for example. But again, we'll see this as a theme. So really, how do identity management and data access governance complete the story? How do they complement each other? Well, if you're an identity person, you know about identities and roles and assignments to groups and things like that. But that's where identity management kind of stops. Where data access governance comes in is it overlays with identity management to talk about these rights and the entitlements to data for finance. Now, there's a guy up here that is representative of the data owner and what role this data owner has in the effective governance of access to this data. And so this is a person in the line of business that is engaged, that understands finance, that understands this data, that understands who needs access to these things. And giving them appropriate visibility is a basic tenet of data access governance, and giving them more control for effective stewardship of their data. So the conclusion is that security requires identity. Yes, even data security. And any discussion around security without identity is practically impossible. So that leads us to our mission. So our mission is very simple. It's to help our customers achieve a better security posture by using identity constructs to govern access to critical data. So you see within this 3 legs of the stool here, identity management, identity governance, and data access governance are all working together. Now, what about this complexity issue that we were referring to earlier? Well, for many organizations, trying to tackle this large data estate is a bit like eating an elephant. Well, we've all heard the story about how to eat an elephant. We take one step at a time. And so the process that we put in place can't be complex. And for many organizations and people operating in control of those organizations, we need to be able to show results rapidly and cheaply and consistently, which means we can't boil the ocean. We need to use the phased approach. If we don't use this methodology, if we don't have a methodology for doing that, basically we're going to have delays, increased expense, we're not going to be able to show progress, and maybe most tragically, all the risks associated with unauthorized access to critical data remain. So the risks remain constant. So to implement a business-oriented data access governance solution, what do we need? We need 2 things. First thing is we need a way to govern access to one of those data locations, like finance or this Project X. And then, secondly, we need a way to identify and prioritize the data that needs protecting in the first place. We can say, yeah, we need to protect all data, but we need to use that phased approach. So let's take a look at each one of these individually. What does it mean to govern access to a data location? This folder. Well, first thing is we need to have an insight into the security that's in place and in an ongoing fashion. We need to be able to talk to our data owner in that area and have him or her understand who has rights to their data, and if that's correct, certifying that, and then if it's not, remediating it. But then that's just the first step. We need to be able to monitor that data location. We need to put policy in place for automation of security, the ability to lock down security in an area, or at least mitigate how it can change. That's bringing in those separation of duties policies. And then lastly, we need to be a way to institute a review process so that we periodically do an access review, which or allow our data owner to do that, which gives us the attestation that we need. Then, number 2, how do we figure out what's the most important things that need protecting? Well, we have a number of approaches for that. actually two. The first one is what I refer to as an intrinsic identification method. That's where we do something crazy. We actually go out and ask the customer or the line of business, hey, where is your highest value data in finance or your highest risk data? Where should it be based on your business strategy? It may be in one place, it may be in three places. That's fine. But at least we're getting that line of business engaged, and we're taking action. We're able to take action more quickly. The second is using a discovery methodology. Now, one methodology that you can use, there's two in here that I'm going to talk about today. The first one is a constituent basis. So, hey, I tell you what, we're going to identify data locations that certain roles use. So we're like, hey, we should probably figure out what the lawyers have access to and start doing a better job of protecting that. So again, you can see where role, identity and role are coming at the front of the ledger here. Secondly, within discovery is we can actually search. We may need to find outlier or misplaced data that needs protecting, or we may need to find clusters of data. So this is where data discovery and classification come in, and you can use any one or all of these in concert with each other. One thing that's interesting about the top two is it lines up really well with Gartner's data security governance framework. If you're not familiar with the Gartner data security governance framework, it's very prescriptive in its methodology. It's saying, hey, let's start up here with the business. Let's talk about what data is most strategic, where do we have the highest risk, where do we have governance and compliance needs, and how does this relate to our strategy? So that lines up really well with those first two methodologies. Then we're going to prioritize those, and then we're going to start to implement technology down here. So using those methodologies, you would come up with a list of candidates for protection, and then you would evaluate those and prioritize them. So then I'm able to prioritize the finance data, the project X data, the merger and acquisition data, and what the lawyers have access to. And that's using that phased approach. So when we refer to these as high value targets, so if we're able to designate some locations and prioritize those, then we can apply protection to it in the ways that we just described with security insight, policy, automation, attestation, all of these things. So just by doing this, we've moved to a better security posture for our organization. Now, we can use data discovery to find clusters or outliers. So we can see outlier data here for finance or for what the lawyers have access to. And then we can actually remediate that into a place that has data access governance applied to it as a methodology for protection. To finish up, we want to talk about the data access governance market, how it's evolving. So if we go back to our landscape, our solution landscape, many of you are customers and maybe you're an identity customer. So you have IDM or you have IG. When you buy data access governance, as it happens, the data access governance products include many things beyond data security that involve data management. So you kind of get both of these at the same time. The file analysis suite from Micro Focus is industry-leading data discovery and classification. So that if you want to use those methodologies and find those outliers, you can. It's important to understand that the scope of IGA is expanding. It's not your father's or your mother's IGA anymore. So, we started out, depending on how long you've been around this market, We started out with Identity Manager, and it was really around provisioning and entitlement management. It's based on applications and associated data. But then then later IG came into picture where we needed to apply governance rules and be able to do things like access reviews for applications. But now we need data to be a first-class citizen right alongside applications. So that's where data access governance comes in. And again, this is that 3 legs of the stool, or the 3-pillar approach. And so that's where we're going and where the market is going. Now, more specifically, data access governance is a market segment that really focuses, as you might imagine, as we've talked about, on inappropriate or appropriate access to unstructured data. So being able to prioritize these high-value data locations, identify who has access, and then correct that and enforce it moving forward. Why we need DAG is really, we talked about structured data being behind applications. And the way users access that data is really pretty regimented. What about unstructured data? Well, people just create these files and stick them out there and access them in a myriad of ways, and the governance or the access controls to that don't have the same regimented methodology that we have with structured data in many cases. So data access governance is giving us that framework to do that. The bottom line about data access governance is that it provides visibility and mapping for how data, where it's located, how people access it, and then the roles and people associated with those roles, how all those things are really related to each other. And then it allows data owners in the line of business to get a better handle on how their data is being accessed and protected. And then we have the ability to do that monitoring and application of role to govern access for this high-value data at rest. The outcome of all that is pretty simple. It reduces the problem scope of compliance and gives you a lot more confidence that your data is being more effectively controlled, better security posture. And that, in effect, streamlines efficiencies for the organization. Now, we don't really think about this last thing very much. When we talk about if we don't get the rights right, and this is kind of a play on words, but right people, right access to the right data in the right location at the right time, if we don't get that right, if we don't get all those right, we end up with these bad things happening here. Overexposure of data, inappropriate exposure of data. And then these other things are manifestations of that. But what we don't talk about a lot is where data is underexposed, where the right people don't have the access that they need to effectively do their job. So what that really results in is duplication of data, loss of productivity, and that in a nutshell is loss of organizational velocity. What types of data might an organization be most concerned with protecting in the first place? The first things that might come to mind are customer data or externally facing data, those kinds of things like PII or PHI, which are more regulated potentially. But there are other classifications or types of data that are strategic to the company, like the intellectual property, the financial data, the strategy of the organization itself, or just mission critical data related to the operation of the organization itself. You may remember the Colonial Pipeline issue in the United States, where Colonial was attacked by ransomware and they had to shut down all of the gasoline distribution to the eastern seaboard of the U.S. In most cases, that the organization might consider some of the data that's less regulated or not regulated to be the crown jewels of the organization that require the most protection from a criticality standpoint. So the problems that we solve with data access governance is the big rocks of meeting compliance requirements for regulated data, insider and external threats and the risk that they pose to these crown jewels that I was just referring to, or more tactical issues around, anarchy and permissions management, or lack of insight in who has access to what, or how people are getting that access. Do the right people have the rights that they need to do their job, or they've moved on from a job and they still have those rights? Or we're trying to pass audits on access, or we're trying to involve line of business in data stewardship, or we're just worried about erosion in structured control, the structure of control over time. I refer to that as entropy. Whether you're using a NIST cybersecurity framework as your guidance, or Gartner, something like Gartner's data security governance framework, we're assessing risk. You're starting with that identification and prioritization, then you're putting policies in place, then you're implementing your security tools so that you can move to that better security posture. So the actions that customers need to take are as follows. They need to assess risk against business needs, prioritize those areas for protection, be able to discover who can access those locations and how they're getting that access. We may need to remediate where data is located, who owns it, the security behind it. We may need to define, or we might move on to then defining policies to actively protect those locations where our most valuable data resides. Obviously, we need to monitor for security changes moving forward, keep those data owners engaged, allow them to do access reviews so that we can have attestation, and then automate things on a life cycle. So in closing, you can really think of data access governance as managing risk associated with unstructured data through visibility. Our file reporter product does that. That's what gives you that insight. Being able to do the monitoring and protection, that's a File Dynamics product in conjunction with Identity Manager for automation. And then to do those access reviews for attestation, we have Identity Governance, where File Reporter is coming into play again with a data feed around security. With that, I really thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. It's been a pleasure. I look forward to our next session together. Obviously, if you have any questions or want to have a more in-depth conversation, we always welcome that. I hope this has been a valuable use of your time. I hope you have a great day. Thank you.